Welcome back, everyone, as we pick up right where we left off with part 2 of Chat History's Something Bad About Every U.S. State's History Explained. If you didn't see part 1 of my reaction, the link will be down in the description, as well as the link to the original. Definitely want to support Chat History. He was gracious enough to stop by after the first video and leave a comment, and he actually mentioned a couple of minor mistakes that he made in that video, and I pinned that comment under that first video so you can check it out. And that's a good reminder that anytime you watch one of my videos, if there is something that I get wrong, because I am reacting to these off the top of my head from knowledge I've previously gained, I'm not reviewing them ahead of time or anything, so occasionally I get stuff wrong. If something like that is brought to my attention, or if I catch it myself, I'll usually pin a comment in the comment section. So always check that out first before you get any further. I do want to give a big shout out and a thank you to Matt in Denver, Colorado. I love Denver, one of my favorite cities. Matt is our newest patron at the executive producer level. And Matt, your name will be reflected soon at the end screen on all the future videos. So thank you so much for that. It means the world to me. I know how important that is, that you do that, and I hope you realize how much it means. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. So I should mention, too, that as this one pops up, one of the things he commented about was that he showed a different state when Georgia comes up here. So,
in the early 1800s,
oh, yeah, that's Iowa.
Colonel William H. Jackson once gifted his favorite oak tree its own deed, legally entitling it to its own ownership and all land within an 8-foot radius of itself. The original tree, located in Athens, Georgia, fell in 1942, but not before an acorn sprouted a new sapling, which legally inherited the land. Why is this bad? That's because there's a chance that this tree owns more land than you do. The Bonneville Salt Flats in
I don't see a problem with that at all. I think that's actually kind of cool.
Utah look like something out of a dream sequence.
Yeah.
Back in the 1920s, with the evolving technology of automobiles, adrenaline junkies would often challenge each other to travel across the flats as fast as possible. Of course, this inevitably led to numerous crashes, breakdowns, and deaths, a tradition that persists to this day. The Silk Strike of 1913 in Paterson, New Jersey was the organized strike of over 25,000 silk workers with the goal of establishing an 8-hour workday and better working conditions. Over the course of the strike's 5-month duration, 300 silk mills had shut down with no workforce, and over 1,800 strikers were arrested for inciting violence. Ultimately, the strike was defeated as influence failed to spread beyond Paterson and no demands were ever met. Speaking of...
I don't know, it doesn't seem so awful to me. I mean, I guess if you're saying the something bad is that nothing ever came of it, but I think it eventually did. The 8-hour workday is pretty standard now. So oftentimes when you see situations like that where people are fighting for something, even though they're not ultimately successful, if you look back, you can see how they all built up to the eventual success of something. You know, it took decades, if not longer, for women to fight for the right to vote in the United States. So you could look back on the early attempts at women's suffrage and say, well, they failed, but they were built upon to eventually achieve success. And inventions are the same way. There were many times that people tried to invent something and failed, but their work was built upon, because often we have to learn how to not do something before we can learn how to do it.
Terrible working conditions, the Radium Girls of Ottawa, Illinois were tasked with hand-painting watches with self-luminous paint made from radioactive powdered radium.
I can actually remember as a kid having an alarm clock that had the glowing lights like that. Now, obviously, by the time I was a kid in the early 1980s, we're not dealing with ones that were painted by the Radium Girls, but...
The women would often point their brushes with their lips to produce finer tips, but their lips inadvertently sipped the radioactive drips, and if one dared to skip the lip tip grip, their managers would flip, so tips remained dipped and their lips remained zipped.
I gotta give him a lot of credit because he is so smooth with those really wordy phrases like that are kind of funny, but also it's a really serious situation.
Company owners expressed the safety of the material, but actively avoided it themselves. The ingestion of the radium, unsurprisingly, caused multiple women to contract radiation poisoning. Between the years of 1917 and 1927, over 50 women had died from acute radiation syndrome. This sparked public outrage and reforms in labor rights. Radium continued to be used in the production of watch dials up to the 1970s.
Wow. So maybe I did, in fact, have one of those if it was still being done in watches up until then. And I should point out, too, that in the first episode, we talked about in New Mexico, the Trinity test, and I mentioned that I didn't think that there were any issues with radiation, but there was actually a nearby girls' dance school or something, and the majority of those girls did not live to very old age because of complications, so there were, in fact, issues from radiation.
Multiple residents outside of Exeter, New Hampshire, all reported seeing the same strange light pattern in the sky across several evenings in 1965. The large object reportedly moved silently across the night sky, emitting eerie red lights in a specific pattern. The event terrified locals in the area for years, though skeptics have debunked this event as simply a mid-air refueling drill performed by the United States Air Force. Specifically, KC-97 tankers flashed red lights in the same exact pattern that was described by eyewitnesses.
And this is why it's important to note that a lot of times when we're talking about things like UFOs or just any unexplained phenomena or unexplained incidents that happen, a lot of times there is a very rational explanation for it. That just because we don't have the answer doesn't mean there isn't an answer. But there are also some things that we've never fully explained.
The city of Wilmington, Delaware experienced a catastrophic outbreak of cholera and typhoid fever in the late 1800s thanks to rapid industrialization shitifying up the local water sources. With hundreds sick and dozens dying, the city had to drastically overhaul the local sewer system, including installing a water purification plant in the early 1900s. But at least you can breathe a fresh sigh of relief nowadays. This is a devil's hole pupfish, a critically endangered and supremely cute species of fish found only in the Devil's Hole in the Death Valley National Park in Nevada. Or Nevada for the locals. The fish were first discovered back in the 1940s and were almost immediately attempted to be protected.
Those are beautiful fish. I've never seen those before, but I love that color.
In 1967, they were officially listed as endangered thanks to local drilling by development companies, which reduced water levels within the cave system. Despite aggressive conservation efforts, there were only 38 of the little guys in existence as of spring 2025, making them one of the most critically endangered species on Earth.
Why are we not taking some of those things in a controlled environment, allowing them to thrive and grow the species a little bit?
The Great Jacksonville Fire of 1901 completely reshaped the city of Jacksonville, Florida. After a rogue kitchen fire broke out, the flames quickly spread to a nearby mattress factory. After more than 8 hours, the inferno finally came under control after completely engulfing the majority of the city, destroying almost 2,400 buildings in the process, rendering 10,000 people homeless and 7 people dead. Now that's what I call a fire sale. Farmers in the late 1960s and early 1970s were pretty pissed to find their precious moo cows slaughtered and mutilated beyond natural means. Investigations clocked in over 8,000 separate mutilations over the years. Some of the bulbous bovines were found to have sedatives in their systems, while others were secretly marked with fluorescent paint. Unidentified aircraft in the area were spotted, suggesting government interventions or possible secret weapons testing, but no conclusive evidence was ever found. 19th century Philadelphia, Pennsylvania saw the rise of several teeth thieves who would go around robbing graves of entire bodies. The corpses would be sold to nearby medical schools for anatomical study, while the teeth were extracted and sold to companies who made dentures.
Yeah, dentures were very often made from real teeth, and you can see similar situations like this on the battlefield at Waterloo. There's a reason we can't find very many bodies from the Battle of Waterloo. A lot of them were taken. They used the teeth for false teeth. They would grind the bones up and use them as fertilizer. And this idea of body snatching was a real problem, especially in the Victorian age, which we're talking about the end of here. If you go to places like Edinburgh, Scotland, you can see mort safes, which are like cages that were built on top of a grave so that people couldn't dig up bodies, and they would put towers on the edges of the cemetery so that guards with guns could guard the cemetery at night to protect against body snatchers.
Remember to smile. Kentucky is home to the McCoy family, one half of the infamous Hatfield-McCoy family feud.
But not even the deadliest feud in Kentucky history. Why do I know that? Because my great-grandmother was a Holbrook, and the Holbrook-Underwood feud of eastern Kentucky was the worst.
Initial squabbles began in the 1870s over the Civil War, with the Hatfields being Confederate sympathizers and the McCoys being pro-Union. Across 30 years...
Yeah, but that's not entirely accurate, and I think the TV show misrepresented that a little bit. There was a McCoy who was a Union soldier. That was Randall McCoy's brother. But Randall McCoy himself was not a Union soldier. But his brother was killed. It was one of many things that escalated this feud. It's a fascinating story.
Here's multiple lawsuits, thefts, and even murders escalated the feud, with over a dozen family members killed. The feud finally came to an end in the late 1890s.
All right, I'm going to stop right there because they talk about a dozen people dying. That's pocket change. That's nothing. It's lint. Let me tell you about a real feud. So it's sometimes known as the Rowan County War, or the Holbrook-Underwood feud is sometimes part of what is known as the Rowan County Wars in Rowan County, but also in Carter County. My Holbrooks came from Olive Hill, Kentucky, which is in Carter County. And the Underwood-Holbrook feud ended up resulting in the death of all the male members of the Underwood family, because our Holbrooks, we don't mess around. We either win or we go home, and we won. Honestly, I grew up hearing all the time that the Holbrooks were people you didn't mess with. I didn't know at the time that my great-grandmother was one of them, and her brother was actually part of the mob and ran a bunch of stuff for the mob here in the Youngstown area. And his name was Matt Holbrook, and I found all these articles about how eventually they couldn't convict him of anything because the mob had everybody in their pocket. So eventually they just asked him to leave the state, but he didn't. He ended up dying. But that's this family. But yeah, over 20 lives were taken in the Holbrook-Underwood feud. I've seen some estimates that show it actually far higher than that, but still more than died in the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys.
Or did it? About 100 years after the start of it all, descendants of the families came together to duke it out on the game show Family Feud in 1979, with the McCoys coming out on top. Nowadays, the family homes are tourist attractions, holding annual festivals with activities like tug-of-war and sight tours to commemorate the decades-long dispute. Just north of South Dakota is North Dakota, and boy did it suffer a harsh winter in 1936. Record low temperatures plummeted all the way down to negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's negative 51°C for you foreigners. The frigid forecast froze farm fauna fleeing for favorable feverishness. Entire towns burned through their coal supplies, leaving families to die in their homes from exposure. In 1847, nearly 200 Dutch immigrants made their way over from the Netherlands to Wisconsin in search of a better life, but a similar cold climate. After months of crossing the Atlantic and scooting in through to the Great Lakes, the freaky-deaky Dutch were just about to set foot in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, when a poorly maintained boiler overheated, causing a fire to erupt on board the very wooden ship. Unfortunately, the ship only had 2 lifeboats, capable of holding about 20 people each. Of the few hundred people aboard, only 45 managed to escape on the lifeboats. The Phoenix, ironically, went down in a blaze, never to rise from the ashes, because they were washed away. Mysterious. So
speaking of Wisconsin, we could talk about the fire that, quite deadly, happened a couple of weeks after the Great Chicago Fire, I think, in 1871. Killed more people than the Great Chicago Fire, but doesn't get talked about because it didn't happen in Chicago. So that's certainly one. If we're going to talk about fiery deaths aboard ships, then the Sultana is definitely one to be talked about. That was in the Mississippi River. I think it was probably near Memphis when it happened. But it was loaded with thousands of Union soldiers. A lot of them were recently freed men from Andersonville prison who had survived that awful prison camp, only to die on the Sultana when it exploded in the middle of the night, packed with thousands of Union soldiers.
This death surrounding the Ray family had caused concern for the townsfolk of Jewett City, Connecticut. The supposedly healthy family members were stricken down left and right from an undetectable killer. The boys of the family became paler by the day and were seen coughing up blood until ultimately passing away within the coming days. The reasonable cause of death, the townsfolk thought, was vampires. In order to stop the undead from rising and killing others, the recently deceased were exhumed from their graves and burned. The real culprit? Tuberculosis. Conveniently enough, though, the burning of the corpses probably did prevent the contagious disease from spreading any further.
To this day, even in modern times in 2025, still the deadliest communicable disease on Earth right now, even though we can treat it.
Go figure. In 1855, the US government approved the import of several camels to serve as pack animals through the arid landscape of the Southwest, formally establishing the United States Camel Corps.
Yep.
But then the Civil War broke out a few years later in 1861, and the camels were either sold off or completely abandoned in the desert, supposedly being spotted over the next several decades. Roam free, fellas.
So it's not directly connected to the U.S. Camel Corps, but there was a camel at the Battle of Vicksburg for the Confederacy. And he was killed by a Union sniper, much to the anger of the Confederate soldiers who cared for this camel. And the camel's actually buried in the Confederate cemetery there in Vicksburg. It's a pretty fascinating story.
Boston, Massachusetts is home to the deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history. The Coconut Grove fire burned itself into people's memories in 1942 with a wealth of poor safety choices leading to the brutal blaze. Exit doors were chained up to prevent unauthorized access, air conditioners were filled with flammable...
If you ever wonder why we have government regulations and rules for businesses, little things like the fact that doors in the U.S. at businesses have to open out, which is weird when I go to like Europe and there are doors that open in. It's very strange because you're just used to doors opening out for this specific reason.
Refrigerants, and everyone was packed in like sardines. Not to mention the fact that all of the lavish interior decor could catch fire faster than a witch in Salem. In all, 492 people ended up dying in the inferno. The club owner, Barney Walensky, who was very much aware of his club's safety code violations, was convicted on just 19 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to just 15 years in prison, though he was pardoned after just 4. He ended up dying a few weeks after release from cancer. Now, when you're chilling in class, the last thing you want to experience is a big old gas explosion. But unfortunately, the students in the New London School in New London, Texas, were about to do just that. Alright class, who could tell me what happens when you hook a big chunk of magnesium into some water? Yep, Ron. That's an easy one. It just, after recently canceling their natural gas supply contract to save a few buckaroos, the school board decided to instead tap into a local gasoline waste line to supplement the demand. The shitty and shoddy plumbing work caused natural gas leaks throughout the school's basement crawl spaces. Now keep in mind that natural gas is colorless and odorless, so no one was really aware of any leaks, except for the student.
And you might say, well, wait, when there's a gas leak, I can smell it. Yeah, that's because they add something to it so that you can smell it.
Who complained of headaches, though they were ignored by the staff.
You get out of here, go on, get.
The creeping gas cloud was inadvertently ignited on March 18, 1937, causing an instantaneous explosion that killed 295 out of roughly 500 students and staff present in the building.
I've never heard about this. Wow. We need to talk about that more.
The disaster led to a reform of requiring odorous additives to be added to natural gas supplies for better detection of leaks. If you're looking for a breath of fresh air...
We had an incident here in Northeast Ohio, the Collingwood fire at a school. I don't remember what set it off, but killed a lot of students. Just a horrible, horrible incident.
New York City is probably not the best place to do so, especially in 1966. The Great New York City smog blanketed the Big Apple in a giant fart cloud of carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and smoke. The dense haze persisted for 3 days across the 1966 Thanksgiving week.
I love the random insertion of the face from Edward Munch's Scream painting in there.
Weekend. A public health study estimated that about 10% of the city's population suffered some adverse health effects from sucking in the smelly smog. In the end, 168 New Yorkers ended up biting the dust, prompting President Lyndon B. Johnson and several members of Congress to produce the 1967 Air Quality Act and amendments to the 1970 Clean Air Act, which heavily reduced air pollution down to more manageable levels of toxicity.
Sometimes it takes an incident like that for people to get their act together. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is a great example of an incident that led to reforms. We talked about a second ago the gas leak down in Texas. Unfortunately, it takes a disaster for people to pay attention to something in many instances.
In the wake of the U.S. Civil War, the South was really hurting for some cheap labor as all of their slaves were just freed thanks to the 13th Amendment. The best alternative? Prisoners. Convicts...
Yeah, well, if you 24601, I like that. That's Jean Valjean from Les Miserables. That's his prisoner number. If you look at the 13th Amendment, it says that involuntary servitude, except in situations where the person has been duly convicted in a court of law. So, like, involuntary servitude by prisoners is allowed if that person has had due process and been convicted and sentenced to that punishment. But it's also important to note that in the aftermath of the Civil War, slavery existed in all but name. Because what they would do is they instituted these laws where these formerly enslaved people could sign a contract where they signed on to work, many of them to work for their former masters, for room and board, no pay, and they were locked into a contract which they couldn't get out of, and that contract could be bought and sold. So in other words, you were living there for no pay and getting fed and housed. The person controlled you and could sell you to someone else. It was slavery in all but name.
Were extremely cheap compared to full-time employees, so in the early 1890s, Coal Creek mine owners decided to lay off their workforce and instead conscripted convicted criminals to work the mines for pennies on the dollar. But instead of milling around, the recently sacked and salty miners decided to pick a fight, sparking the Coal Creek War of 1891. The manic miners attacked a load of state prisons and mining properties, ensuring their efforts would not be in vain. The National Guard was called in, arresting over 500 workers. The scuffle did result in Tennessee ending their convict leasing program in 1896, so that's a win. Sweet Home, Alabama is home to Yellow Mama, an electric chair built in 1927 by master carpenter and inmate Ed Mason. 152 criminals have gotten the sweet, stinging embrace of Yellow Mama's arms, with her final zap being performed in 2002.
So, it shows Madden. The very first execution by electric chair was an axe murderer named William Kemmler, and they didn't get the info right on how to properly electrocute somebody, and they basically cooked him to death because they didn't use the right voltage or the right amount of juice to kill him properly.
Since then, death row inmates were given the legal right to choose their demise, either lethal injection or the chair, and to no surprise, they opt for the less painful option. As such, Yellow Mama remains locked away in the attic of the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, patiently waiting for her next victim. Imagine your life as a beaver, munching away on a tree or building a dam, when all of a sudden you get yoinked away from your beaver family, put in a tiny box, flown up to the sky, and hucked out of an airplane to be parachuted down miles away from home. That's exactly what the Idaho Department of Fish and Game did in 1948 after locals complained of excessive property damage. 76 beavers were relocated from northwest Idaho to central Idaho via airdrop using leftover World War II parachutes.
I don't know. I mean, the alternative is what? You kill them, right? So this doesn't seem so bad to me.
One beaver died. Very sad. A big-ass swarm of locusts tore across the Midwest in 1874, devastating any and all vegetation, food, clothes, and farming equipment for days on end, with Nebraska taking most of the damage.
See, this is the thing. A lot of people think about locusts. They think about the cicadas, which we get, like 7 or 17-year cicadas that pop up and are really loud and noisy and might do a little damage, but they aren't like horrifyingly damaging massive creatures that swarm in and in a matter of 20 minutes wipe out your crop. But those do exist, and I think they're pretty frequent in Africa, but dang. Ooh.
Sources were contaminated and livestock were consumed. High estimates place the swarm size at upwards of 12.5 trillion locusts. I mean, there were quite literally a blanket of locusts a foot high off the ground. The swarm, spanning across 2 million square miles, reportedly blocked out the sun for multiple hours during their flight. By the time the locust plague had passed, the Midwest had sustained over $200 million in crop damages. Bennington Triangle, located across southwestern Vermont, saw several people disappear under mysterious circumstances between 1945 and 1950. The most well-known case being the disappearance of 18-year-old student Paula Jean Weldon.
I know, I'm starting to feel like, without hearing this story, maybe the triangle just is drawn around the place a serial killer lives? I don't know.
Who up and vanished in 1946 and was never seen again. The young girl had reportedly left her college campus in the afternoon and proceeded to walk 6 miles to a nearby trail before going missing. Lack of substantial police investigation, evidence, or witnesses left the case cold. The poorly run investigation had prompted the Vermont legislature to create the Vermont State Police just 7 months after Paula Jean's disappearance. Hundreds of Lakota...
Okay, but what was the deal? Like, it was just one person? Or is that just one of the people in that area? I feel like there's probably an explanation that it involves some psycho killer person there. If somebody knows, let me know in the comments section.
2 natives were gunned down during the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 after natives began expressing frustration and anger over continued forced relocation and broken promises from the U.S. government.
You suck.
A new religious movement called the Ghost Dance, a literal dance performed in hopes of ridding the land of white settlers, was seen as a potential act of rebellion.
That's scary. I don't like that.
And understand the context. This is, 14 years after the Great Sioux War, the one that involved Custer and his men being wiped out, things like that. And so there's still kind of a lot of people on edge here, and it's the perfect storm. We did a video on this. It's a perfect storm of misunderstandings and heightened anxiety and people with wrong motives already that result in a lot of innocent people ending up dying.
As a precaution, natives were rounded up and disarmed by the U.S. Army. A misunderstanding surrounding an accidental misfire of a rifle started the massacre, which saw the murder of about 300 native men, women, and children. Montana is...
I'm not entirely sure the number's that high, but it doesn't change the fact that it was wrong and horrible.
Home to one of the most famous archaeological hoaxes of all time. The Cardiff Giant. A quote-unquote petrified man supposedly recovered from a well in 1869 by 2 local workers. The giant hardened human stood at over 10 feet tall and weighed about 3,000 pounds. The giant acted as an attraction to which thousands of tourists flocked for 50 cents a pop, roughly $12 in today's money accounting for inflation. Visitors stood in complete awe at the supposed relic of human history as proof of how giants once...
Look at the one guy, he's got a big old smile on his face. Like, I know this is a hoax, but I'm going with it anyway. This guy over here is smiling too.
Roamed the earth, but in reality, the stone statue was just that, a statue. It was created by one George Hull in an attempt to show how easily the public could be fooled by fake artifacts. He constructed the statue and buried it in the aforementioned well, where, a year later, he instructed his unaware workers to dig it up as a genuine artifact.
Well. Shut up. Okay.
After just 2 months of worldwide spectacle, Hull proudly confessed to the hoax as one big gotcha moment, calling everyone a bunch of stupid idiots.
And this has happened in some instances with things that have been found that have been said to be, there's evidence of the missing link between, man and man's ancestors. And in some of those cases, we don't know what they are, and there could very well be something to it. But in some cases, they've turned out to either be a hoax or to be something like one of them, I think, was just the tooth of an extinct pig. And they made a whole, hominid species out of it. So sometimes it's a lack of understanding plus a little bit of I really want this to be something that turns into these things.
There you go. That's something historically bad about every U.S. state. If you want to hear...
Okay, that was great. Chat History always does a great job. It's a great mix of information but also humor, and I think he does a fantastic job. So link is in the description if you want to check out Chat History and see some of his other videos. I'm also adding this video to a playlist with all of my reactions to Chat History's content if you want to check that out. Thanks for watching.